Good afternoon for some, good morning, and good evening to others. I am Dr. Froswa Booker-Drew, and I'm so excited to share with you today about the power of knowing your narrative. And so we're going to cover a lot of information very quickly, but please use the chat box if you have questions. I'll be glad to answer those as we go through the presentation. I'm going to put my timer on and we will get started. And so I am currently Vice President of Community Affairs for State Fair, Texas, where I get a chance to do amazing work and use this knowledge to build relationships in the community. And then I've been working in nonprofit management for a long time, and I am the author of several books. They're workbooks for women to really help women think about the power of their narrative and how they use their stories to better connect to themselves, to their faith, to one another. And so we'll go on and get started. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what is the case for connecting. Why is that important? But we're going to also talk about the power of your story and knowing your narrative and how it helps you connect to your ideas and purpose, but also to others. And then we're going to talk a little bit about this term that I have spent so much time researching with my PhD called social capital. We'll talk a little bit about my story. Because of time, we won't be able to do a whole lot with that. And then we'll talk a little bit about what are some aha moments and what are rules of engagement for you as you take this information and move to the next step. And so why are we so busy to connect and listen? Because part of having relationships and being able to connect to others requires us to create the space to be available and to listen. And so we have this perception that we just don't have enough time. And as we begin to have more resources, we begin to see our time as being more valuable. And as a result, when we see our time in terms of money, we begin to become very conservative in the way that we use our time. And so we don't value relationships as much as I think we should. And as a result, we don't create the space to have relationships and not only have them, but to leverage them, to invest in those relationships. And so let's talk a little bit about why is that important and what is the case for connecting and why we need to make sure that we're not too busy to create relationships with others and take the time to listen to how our stories inform our relationships. And so I love Gallup's work because they have done some amazing work on these well-being indicators. And what they have been able to do is really look at when there are challenges and outbreaks of violence in communities, they can basically predict when those happen based on these ideas or these categories where it looks at these five elements where it's purpose, social, financial, community, and physical. And of those, if you notice, purpose is about connecting to self. So when people don't feel like they have a sense of purpose, that's when you begin to see even more of us versus them. Or when people don't have the ability to have social connections, kind of like the time that we're in now, where we're hearing more about socially distancing, which I hate that term because really what we're doing is physically distancing. But we need to make sure that we're having the social connections. But when we don't have that, it impacts our well-being. And when people don't feel financially stable or feel a sense of connection to their community, whether that's their local community or some cause or group, and when they don't feel safe, that's when we begin to see people's well-beings impacted. And that's the thing that we need to pay attention to now. I really believe that this pandemic is going to cause other pandemics in the sense of the mental health. And so if we're not being very intentional about the relationships that we're creating to sustain us and maintain us in this time, our well-being is going to be impacted severely, not just at the individual level, but we're going to see that impacted at a community level and at a societal level. And so research has shown that relationships are very, very important and how they impact us. And so I love the Blue Zone research. If you have not had an opportunity to look at that, this research really looks at communities where people have lived to be over 100 years old. And what they have found in these communities is there are certain things that these folks do in each of them. There's one in Loma Linda, California. There's a community of folks who've lived to be over 100 in Japan. And what they have found is that there are these common threads that exist. One is all of them tend to have a glass of wine, which I thought, well, I might live to be 100 as well if that's one of the parameters. But in addition to that, they have a plant-based diet. But they also have a faith community. But they have purpose and they feel they have a sense of purpose, but they also feel connected to a community where they're playing bridge or they're walking with a group. So people who live longer, research has shown that having relationships contributes to our longevity. And so social networks have shaped their health behaviors. And so it's important for us to know that our relationships not only contribute to our physical and mental well-being, they contribute to our health. And so our entire well-being, and I love this quote, depends upon belonging and engaging in relationships, and not only doing that, but feeling like we're contributing to it. So there is something to be said about the case for connecting, because in doing so, it contributes to our purpose and contributes to our health and our well-being. And so it's important for you to pay attention to your voice and your story. And what is the story that you tell about relationships? What is the story that you tell about the way in which you connect to others? And our identities are tied to the stories that we tell. And so there is this term called narrative identity, which basically says that the stories that we tell about ourselves define who we are and how we see others. So when people are talking about their own stories, their identities are part of those stories. So we learn a lot about people. And I often share the story that when I was very young, I remember not trusting girls because I was bullied profusely as a girl in school. And so that narrative continued throughout my high school years where I had friends, but I was always very apprehensive about really connecting deeply. And until I realized the narrative I was telling about my relationships, I continued to attract that and bring that energy into my space. And once I began to pay attention to that and recognize the narrative I was telling was giving me more of that narrative, and I changed it. It was amazing how my relationships began to change. I have such an amazing group of women that are my friends and who support me and love me so well. And it was because of the identity that I had created, I began to attract more of that in my life. And so being aware of our identities are tied to our stories. What is the story that you tell about relationships? What do you think when you look at your past? How is that coming out in the way that you connect to other people? It's important to be aware of that. And then our narratives not only share our identity, they share our relationships, whether those are strong or weak. You know, when you think about LinkedIn, LinkedIn is a wonderful resource, but you know, you have these actors, so to speak, the people you connect to. And your third level of connection would be considered weak, whereas the person that's in the first level would be strong. And for many of us, we may not even know the people that are in the first level of our relationships. But how do we begin to start investing in our relationships and the stories we tell about those relationships? How do we begin to start making sure that we're creating the space to have strong relationships and watching the stories that we tell about that? But also our narratives talk about our emotions and our well-being and how we see the world. And lastly, they share whether we come from a place of being strong or we stagnant. Do we see ourselves as victors, or do we see ourselves as victims? And so narratives are so important because they impact the way we connect to not only ourselves, but how we connect to others. And so think about, how do your stories shape and define who you are? How does this impact your work? And how does it impact your community, whether that's your job community or the social environments that you're involved in, how are your stories contributing to those relationships? And then thinking about those stories, how are they shaping and influencing the level of relationships that you not only have, but what you aspire to have? So paying attention to our narratives is critical in building relationships. And our narratives share who we are. So there's some great research that's done by two um, scholars, Lovins and Avello is the other, and they've come up with this term called psychological capital. And psychological capital is really about these elements. It's about self-efficacy, optimism, hope, and resilience. And so when someone has strong psychological capital, these areas are very present. And one of the things I often share with people is hope is something that can not only help move the way we see ourselves, it is a form of capital even in communities, because hope is the thing that keeps us going. And when we lose hope, it's hard to even connect to other people. If you don't feel like you have a place and you feel like you have no hope, then it's so easy for you to dismiss the lives of others. And we see that quite often now. And so hope is very important for us to have as a part of that strength we mentioned earlier. And so all of these elements, resilience is also a part of that. So how does this show up in the narratives that you tell about yourself? Are you sharing hope in your narratives? Are you sharing the resilience of what you've gone through? And are you positive about the possibilities, even in the midst of a pandemic? And if we're intentional, our stories can connect us very well. There is this term that's come out, and quite a bit of research has been on this idea of high quality connections. And I always compare this to when you meet someone and they're so negative and you walk away and think, oh my God, I need an adult beverage, because they have just drained the life out of you. Some people would term that energy vampires. But what this is the opposite of that. It's when you meet someone and you immediately click, and it's like you've known them for years. So they've been researching what high quality connections look like, and what is it? And so these kinds of connections create lasting impressions, and they allow us to be ourselves. So even if we have disagreements, these kinds of connections allow us to express who we are and our emotions. But this is the other thing, they can deal with tension. So if there is a disagreement, if there is problems in the relationship, we can still be friends and talk through that, but we're engaged and participating. And so we want to start thinking about who are those high quality connections in our lives, and beginning to think about how do you continue those relationships, and what's been the narrative that you've told to have those kinds of connections in your life. I know I've met a number of people who fit in this category for me. And I think part of it goes back to that psychological capital, where our emotional well-being is such that we are able to see not only ourselves in a positive light, but we're able to see that in one another. And so these kinds of connections are important because they also contribute to the stories that we tell about ourselves and tell about our communities. And so I mentioned earlier, part of what we were going to discuss is this term called social capital, and what is it and why does it matter? Social capital is a term, and I'm very honest with people, I have some issues with it because I don't necessarily believe that all relationships are transactional. I don't know if you remember, but there was a television commercial in the US where it was a company that was selling cable services. And for every friend that you referred, you got this money amount for it. And that bothered me to see that relationships were about this transaction. Well, there are relationships that are transactional. When you go to McDonald's, you're not waiting for the person to tell you the story of their life and you all sing Kumbaya when it's over. What you really are hoping is, I pay you an amount of money, I want my fries back, and it's an exchange. Well, we're going to have those kinds of transactional relationships. But what I'm interested in is the transformative relationships. And so social capital, because of the term capital in it, to me denotes that it's about transaction, when in actuality, we can have them both, where they're transactional and transformative. Social capital is a term that was coined by a gentleman by the name of Hannafin. in the 1800s, and he saw a group of parents talking, and he coined the term, they were sharing social capital. The term has evolved in a number of iterations where it's been used in economics to look at this idea, as I mentioned, actors and how we connect and have these first and second degree connections, and morphed into this ideal of social network analysis, which is really what LinkedIn is looking at these levels of relationship and how people are connected to it. But who's made it so impactful in the last several years is a man by the name of Robert Putnam. And Putnam is someone that I just love his work. And Putnam wrote a book in 2010 called Bowling Alone. And what Putnam says in this book is that social capital is about relationships, it's about associations, it's about networks. And all of us have social capital, and we typically don't see ourselves as having this amazing resource in our lives that helps us connect to each other and contributes to the way we tell our stories. And so I'm going to kind of go through these other forms of capital because I think it's very important to note that all of us have this in some way. And I don't think we recognize our own power. I think we sometimes look outside of ourselves and not see the currency that we have. And so our social capital is really a form of currency. It's looking at the way we make connections in our relationships. But in addition to that, there's financial, which we're all aware of, but I don't think we also look at the spiritual capital and how having that and meditating and prayer and however you decide to focus on something bigger than yourselves is a form of capital, because that's hope. And then the cultural capital, we're talking about the stories and how our stories and that oral tradition contributes to a community and actually creates legacy. And so all of us have these forms of capital. And I don't think we pay attention to that and see that as a part of our stories, because quite often our stories tend to focus so much on lack, or I don't have the finances, and not seeing that there is so many other types of resources that we all embody and that we all bring to the table and that are just as important, if not more. And so I mentioned this about the definition of social capital. It really is about the networks, the associations, the relationships. All of us have what's called physical capital. So this computer would be considered that. Or if you get an education, that's human capital, your education, your expertise. All of those are important, but what really makes those things work is relationships. So if I don't know how to make my computer or to turn it on or do the Zoom stuff, which has been a problem in a pandemic, in all honesty, I needed to have relationships, whether it was calling a friend or whether it was calling tech support. Relationships are important for most of these things that we need in society to happen. Someone has to build it and someone has to sell it. So relationships are at the center. And what we need to recognize is trust is what's so important in building social capital. You cannot move the needle without having trust. One of the things that Putnam says in his book that's so fascinating to me is he talks about communities that thrive. And he says that communities that have high social capital have higher educational outcomes. He says that communities that have high social capital also have lower crime. But the other thing that he states is communities with high social capital, people vote. And so there is something to be said about how social capital not only connects us to each other, but it actually can move a society when people feel that they can participate and they feel that they're engaged and that they can trust one another and they can trust the process. Social capital informs our stories. So things like education and income and employment are associated with the size of our network. And so where we work also has an impact on our network. So I'm always pushing people to think about how do you diversify your network where everyone doesn't look just like you or thinks the way that you do. Because when we expand our networks and build relationships outside of what is comfortable, then what we do is we're able to get more information. We're able to get more resources because of having diverse networks. And so social capital plays such a role in even the way that our lives look like. In addition to our stories, it makes a difference in the way that our lives look and the kinds of opportunities that we will have access to. And so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail for the sake of time, but I was very blessed because I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and very young, I saw the power of relationships. My dad, as a Black man in the early 70s, opened a restaurant in the 80s. He had gone to college and was a physical education major, realized he wasn't going to make any money teaching, and then he decided to wait tables at a restaurant. The gentleman who had the restaurant taught my dad everything that he needed to know, and as a result, my dad opened his own restaurant in the 80s. And I saw all of these different people coming in and out of the restaurant who were football players and folks who had all these amazing experiences, and I saw such diversity, and I saw my parents interacting with these folks. That made such a difference in my life and how I saw the world. And so I was very fortunate to be around very young people who were very different and who had very different viewpoints and opinions than I did. And that has been the common thread throughout my life when I look at from the time I was a kid and the church that I grew up in until now as an adult, and a seasoned adult. As I see that, I look at the web, the thread that has been woven in these amazing relationships, and I would not be where I am or who I am had it not been for people in my life like a Michelle Bobadilla, who saw me as a college student volunteering and opened the door for me to get a career right out of college. Or had it not been for mentors like Zeb Strong, who saw something in me and said, hey, let me get you involved on campus. And I'm constantly sharing with people, it's important for you to think about in your own story, who have been the mentors in your life, but who have also been the sponsors. And there's a difference. Mentors are the people who coach you and give you advice. A sponsor is the person who uses their social capital to open up doors for you. And I've been very fortunate to have folks who were both mentors, some were sponsors, and some did the job of a mentor and sponsor at the same time. But all of those relationships have crafted the person that I am today. And so I want you to also think about, as you look at your life, how have relationships shaped who you are and how you live in the world, and your opportunities and things that have happened for you? Relationships are critical. And the stories that we tell about ourselves really impact and shape the way we connect to others. And so I want to give you a couple of rules of engagement because I think it's so important for you to think about it as you move forward, your own story and how you connect to others. And I'll say this, one of the most powerful exercises that I did was years ago, and I'm making my students at Tulane do that this semester, is write something called a reflective leadership essay. This was the most powerful writing. It will take you a weekend, but thinking about the power of leaders and mentors in your life from the time you're a kid until now, and beginning to see how that has shaped your leadership and shaped how you see the world. And I don't think we really are intentional about going back and looking at those experiences, good, bad, and ugly, and how they shape how you show up. And so it's important for you as you move forward to reflect and think back and process on how those experiences shape you, because sometimes those things continue to show up and it's because we haven't dealt with them or resolved them and paid attention to them. So pay attention to the story if you learned anything today. Knowing your story will help you better connect to others. And then you want to know the difference between these two types of social capital. There's bonding social capital, and then there's bridging social capital. Bonding social capital is connecting to people that are just like you. That's easy because it's comfortable. What I would challenge you to do is start thinking about how do you build what's called bridging social capital. That is connecting to people who are very different than you are, not just race, ideology. You know, there was a study that came out a couple of months ago that talked about when people feel that they are in a community and they can't find folks who have the same ideology that they do, they tend to retreat and hide. In this world right now, we don't need to hide. We need spaces for us to come together, even in disagreement, and come together and begin to listen and understand. We cannot afford to continue to polarize ourselves because it's not good for who we are, and it's not good for the world that we would love to see and create. And so focus on not just bonding, which is important. There's nothing wrong with being around people who are like you. We all want those familiar spaces because of history and culture. But I would challenge you to start thinking about how do you diversify your network and beginning to do what's called bridging social capital. I would also encourage you to pay attention to the work of Amanda Sinclair. She wrote a book about disillusioned leadership. And in the book, she talked about the leaders of Enron and WorldCom. And what she says is that these folks did not pay attention to the stories that they had as children. And because they did not pay attention to it, they ended up ruining the lives of so many people because they tried to recreate a story instead of paying attention to the one that they actually had and trying to figure out how to fix that. So painful childhoods many of us have had. The thing is that we can't ignore that. We have to pay attention to it because it shows up in our stories, and it shows up in the way that we interact with others. And they ruin people's lives because of not paying attention and trying to recreate something that was false. All of these things shape our stories, our language, our gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality. All of these shape our stories and who we are. And it's important. And then we might miss out on real connections because of our perceptions of people. I love this meme that says one of these is a convicted felon, because quite often it's so easy to look at the Snoop Dogg and go, oh, he must be the one. And I recognize it's a beloved Martha Stewart. So our perceptions are dangerous. We can miss out on some amazing relationships with some wonderful people because we allow stereotypes and our judgments to prevent us from really having some amazing experiences. So check those. And then these are some rules that I want you to consider as you move forward. Without understanding a person, it's so easy to stereotype people and not lack compassion on how people arrived at their current situation in life. And so I know there are people that when I first met them, I was kind of like, ooh. And once I learned their story, it made me have so much compassion and understanding. And even with some to say, I understand, you should actually go nuts because of what you've endured, and look at how you've been able to make it. So be careful with that. Create the space to listen to stories, because all of us are here because of a story and a relationship or multiple relationships. Our stories share a psychological capital. So keep that in mind as you're talking to people and building relationships. And we have to know the identity that we're sharing in our stories, and know that other people are sharing their identities as well and the stories that they tell about themselves. Recognize that our narratives are so important. They have the power to influence, to educate. And so taking the time to listen, I'm always amazed at how people want to just come in and start having conversation without really taking the time to listen. And so create spaces to not only share, but to listen to others. And that's when we're exposed to new narratives, to new ideas, to new realities. I often tell my daughter that we live in a world that's so focused on this ideal of either or. And so often it really is about both and, that multiple realities can exist at the same time, that you can be correct and so can someone else. And I think sometimes we diminish that and try to make someone's ideas less than because they don't align to how we grew up or what we believe. And that's so unfortunate. And so we need to make sure that we're allowing ourselves to have these moments, as I call them, of cognitive dissonance, where you have these moments where it's a crash, where someone says something that you don't necessarily agree with, and it creates this thing in the pit of your stomach where you're uncomfortable. And the question you have to ask yourself is, why does that bother you? And begin to wrestle with it. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're right or wrong, but you want to analyze, why is it creating the experience that you're having about it, and wrestle in that space. And what happens quite often is so many of us retreat from being uncomfortable that we don't begin to deal with it, because it will challenge our identity. It will begin to make us question our values and our core beliefs. And for many of us, we need to really begin to start reconciling those things and questioning them. Why do we believe the things that we believe? Because of what we were taught very young, the stories that we heard growing up. We have to be okay with knowing that there are people who their right may not be our right, but they both can exist and be real at the exact same time. And then this is one of the things that I love this quote. It's one of my favorites because ultimately connections really should be about empowering others to be the best at who they are, because we are so aware of our own purpose and so aware of our own stories and the people that are around us. That should be so liberating for other people. And so, if we're in leadership roles, particularly, and I believe all of us in some way are leaders, one of the things that should be our goal is we should want to show up and be with people. And I love this quote, that it's go to the people, live with them, love them, learn from them, work with them, start with what they have, build on what they know. And in the end, when the work is done, the people will rejoice and they will say, we have done it ourselves, not you, somebody came in and saved us. No, because you allowed your power to come in and allow other people to be who they are and be comfortable in the stories that they tell about themselves. So what are some things that we need to consider moving forward in a COVID context? Because I've been asked this at a number of presentations. Well, how do we build social capital? And, what's going to happen? Well, I think we need to be aware of there are going to be changes in our workplace. Some of us are going back to work with a number of protocols that are in place. Some people are still working from home. But what we do know is there's going to be an increased use of technology. We're already seeing it with Zoom and Hopin and all these other platforms. The way that we connect to people in public. I'm a hugger. And so it's very hard for me when I see people with my mask and I want to go up and hug and I'm like, and we really shouldn't even do the elbow thing they're saying now. So we got to know that even the way that we've been accustomed to connecting in public is going to change. Our stories are going to change because we're in the midst of a history-making moment. We're in the midst of this pandemic and several other pandemics that are racial unrest and social injustice and so many other things, mental health. And so what is your story in the midst of this pandemic? How do you tell the story of resilience and not allow this to be the story of defeat? Paying attention to the story that we tell even in this moment is so critical and important. And then what I would suggest in the midst of this pandemic is how do you start setting goals around building relationships? So I mentioned the leadership essay and looking at the stories that have been woven throughout your life, paying attention to that may be on your plan, but you want to start looking at your existing relationships. So how do you go on to LinkedIn and send people notes and go, I just want to have a virtual coffee with you just to reconnect, or it may be someone that you've always wanted to know. How do you use that tool? Or Schaefer, it's SHAPHR is another wonderful tool similar to LinkedIn. That's a little more focused on areas of like, do you want a mentor? Are you looking for an investor? But it's a little more detailed. How do you use platforms like that to help you begin to build relationships? But just as you set goals for your life, relationships should also be a part of your goal setting. And so I would strongly encourage you to think about how do you create this 30, 60, 90-day plan to begin to be intentional and deliberate about the way that you're building relationships. Are there friends that you have not talked to in a number of years? Is this an opportunity to begin to reach out to people and use Zoom? One of the things I'm doing this year is a milestone birthday, and I plan to do this huge party, and I'm having to change that. So I'm doing a Zoom party. So what are ways in which you can be really creative where you can still have the music and have games and different things online with your friends where you're not able to be in person? Even in the midst of this, there are ways that we can still build relationships and we can still connect to other people and we can still continue to tell the amazing story of this journey called life. And so I know we're ending a little bit early, but here is my contact information. If you've got any questions or want to reach out to me, I am available. Are there any questions? I'm looking in the chat that anyone may have, or any ahas that you may have regarding how you build relationships and build the strong connections for community. Okay. Well, if there aren't any questions or comments, then we can end the presentation a bit early. I'll wait a few more minutes if there aren't any comments in the chat or any ahas that anyone would like to share. We can wait a few more minutes for that. But definitely feel free to reach out to me without doing any shameless plugs. I've written a number of books that are available for you to use to help you in this space and thinking about how you build relationships with others. And so someone has sent a note, who you need to be in community. How does it help others to be who they need to be? Excellent question, Nancy. So when you show up, you are allowing other people to be authentic and show up. There's a quote by Marianne Williamson that is one of my favorite quotes in the world. And what she says in this quote is that when you don't shine, you are, and you're not being the totality of who you are, and I'm paraphrasing, you are not allowing others to see the fullness of who you are. And as a result, they don't get to experience all that you were created to be. And so when you are able to show up in community and be all that you have been created to be, and you are not hiding, because I think a lot of people feel that that's boasting, but when we are hiding, we prevent other people from shining their light too. So when our light shines, and that's what she says, is when our light shines, we give people the freedom to shine their lights. And so it's important for us to be authentically who we are, because it allows other people to do the same. And so, Nancy, I hope that helped your question. But Marianne Williamson, that quote comes from her book, A Course in Miracles. And so I'd encourage you to pick that up, but also thinking about how do you use journaling as an, yeah, you know, that quote is one of my favorites, but how do you even use journaling to help you with the story that you tell about yourself and how you show up? I think we all have been given these mixed messages growing up about how we show up in spaces. But as I get older, I'm learning more and more that when I am authentic and I'm caring and generous, because I would always hear, you know, this thing about nice guys finish last. And for me, and trying to be that kind of person deprives me of being truly who I am. And so I just decided to be the person who's always giving, who's always kind, who's generous. And that has opened up so many doors and been such a blessing to me and so many people around me. I love that you're writing your autobiography. And yes, because it does allow you to see, even as a kid, when you may not have had the power and other people may have had so much control, that you see your resilience. And I think it's important for us to go back and look at those stories throughout our lives, those relationships, to see how those stories impact and shape who we are and how strong we are. Some of us have gone through some things that a lot of people would not be able to endure, and you need to be able to celebrate that. We don't spend enough time celebrating who we are and celebrating those stories of resilience and hope and self-efficacy. So Nancy, congratulations on writing the autobiography. I think that's awesome. Yes, also looking at decisions that I can go beyond. Yes. So thinking about what are the things that you can do next. I think it's so important for us, especially as women, that we continue to dream. I remember when my daughter was 5 and I was getting ready to quit a job. I had worked at the same place that she was going to school. And she said to me, "Mommy, why are you leaving?" And I said, "Well, Mama has dreams." And she goes, "You dream?" And that was so impactful for me, because I don't think we recognize that for those around us, when they get to see us living our best life and they see us doing the things that we've always dreamed of, it gives them the hope to believe they can do the same thing too. And so I love that you're doing this Dream Factory community. Help people dream, help people have hope and see the possibilities. Nancy, you're planting some seeds that are going to be huge trees. So I just encourage you to keep doing the amazing work that you're doing, that you're pouring into other people's lives, because it's so needed, especially in a season like this where people feel hopeless and don't feel like they have opportunities. And you're opening doors for people to see possibilities. So congratulations, Nancy, on the work that you are doing. It's so impactful and important. Well, I'm just elated that I had the opportunity to share. I know it was in such a condensed amount of time. This usually is a presentation that takes a bit longer, but I wanted to condense it for the time that we have. And I hope you got some points out of it and thinking more strategically about the way that you build relationships, thinking about your own currency, that you have social capital, your networks are currency. It is a form of power. So begin to start thinking about that, thinking about how your stories are a form of currency and that they have power. I want you to start thinking about how you are intentional about building your social capital and building your network. How are you not just building a network that is one that looks like you, as I mentioned earlier, but how are you building one that is diverse and includes all kinds of people and ideas, so that as you get this information, you're able to grow and expand the work that you do, because you have now all these amazing resources in your life. I would strongly encourage you to continue to think about how do you do that, because it makes a difference. And then look me up on LinkedIn. I am so excited to meet new people and to connect and look at ways as what Nancy is doing to help all of our dreams come true, and helping us think about purpose and connecting to purpose. If you haven't done, and I'm going to give this tip, if you haven't done your own personal mission statement, I would strongly encourage you to do that. Lori Beth Jones, who is an amazing author, has a worksheet that you can go and find. It's a part of her book, The Path. And in this, she helps you think about how to create your own personal mission statement. Knowing our purpose also helps us better connect to other people. And so think about creating your own personal mission statement. But in addition to that, you should also think about how you create your own personal board of directors. We do that for organizations, and those of you who run nonprofits, you may have a board, but you should strongly think about developing your own personal board of directors. These are the people that are the mentors, the sponsors, the folks that hold you accountable and that make sure that you're on track. They're the ones who are asking you the hard questions and pushing you to be your best. And so if you don't have a personal mission statement, if you don't have a personal board of directors, you really want to put that in that 30, 60, 90-day plan that I shared today, because that is such an important part of your success and your future. So are there any other comments in the chat, or any ideas or ahas that anyone had as a result of the presentation? I'd love to hear that, or any questions that I may be able to help you with. Feel free to submit those while we have a few minutes left remaining in the presentation. And again, Nancy, kudos to you. You're doing some great work. All right, well, if we don't have anything else, oh, yes, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate you. Anything else that anyone wants to add before we close the presentation? Well, I appreciate you all being here. Again, you've got my email information that's on the slide at info@drfroswa.com, and feel free to send me a note. I'd love to be able to share some information. If you have any questions or want to know some of the readings that I suggested, feel free to send those to me. And I'll be glad, or send me the ones that you want to know more about, and I'll be glad to send that information to you as well. So thank you all so much for coming today. I'm just elated that I had the opportunity to share this information. I hope you have a wonderful remainder rather of your weekend. Thanks a lot.